Alright, let us finish chapter 9 with section 4, the Treaty of Versailles. And as we discovered in the last video, the war ended in November of 1918 with an armistice. And after the fighting stopped, we got around to the making of the peace. And that eventually, of course, becomes the Treaty of Versailles. As it states here, at the end of the war, separate treaties were concluded. Separate treaties were reached with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Turkish Empire. Those are the three main countries that the Allies were fighting. President Woodrow Wilson, traveled to Europe to help negotiate these peace treaties. He, of course, was the President of the United States at this time. He, of course, was Commander-in-Chief of the AEF, which won the war, really. Let's call it what it truly was. Without the American forces, the war probably would have ended in a stalemate or the bad guys winning. Without the American forces, the Allies probably would not have won. So he is an important player in this process. And of course, he already has put out his 14 points. He is traveling there to attempt to come up with a credible, a workable solution that would incorporate many of those 14 points. Now, he made a huge, critical mistake and not taking along with him, not inviting influential Republican senators. Keep in mind, Wilson is a Democrat. He was the third progressive president, the first Democrat progressive president. And he did not take along with him people like, any of the senators who would be beneficial in getting this agreement, this treaty, passed in the Senate. And we'll talk about one of them in a few moments, the next slide or two. Anyway, he did not invite them to go along with him, and since the Senate, of course, is responsible for ratifying treaties, it pretty much doomed it. Almost immediately upon arrival, Wilson came into conflict. He reached some kind of conflict with other allied leaders at the Paris Peace Conference. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson, did not really wish to assign blame or punish the losers, and the other allies, England and France, wanted to impose a very harsh treaty upon Germany and make the Germans pay for the war. Woodrow Wilson, did not want the Germans harshly treated. He did not want them paying for the war. He felt that it was best that we end it as quickly as possible and get back to as normal as quickly as possible. He, of course, was overruled by the others. Why? Well, partially because he had to make several concessions, as we see on the next slide right here. He had to make certain concessions in order to get support from the other Allied leaders for the creation of the League of Nations. Now, this was his baby. This was his top key. Hold on just a second. Sorry, I'm back. My phone is ringing. I had to go answer it. Anyway, as I was saying, Woodrow Wilson had to make many concessions in order to get the Allied leaders to go along with this creation of the League of Nations. As I said, or as I was saying when I was interrupted, the League of Nations was his top priority. Of his 14 points, this is the one he felt that this was the most important. So he made certain concessions in terms of the treatment of Germany and the Treaty of Versailles in order to get the League of Nations to be born. The final terms of the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace treaties, okay, again, there were separate peace treaties for the three nations that we fought against, all supported nationalism, but ended up being extremely harsh on Germany and the other defeated powers. Now, more than anybody else, Germany paid the price for the war. We've already talked about the war guilt clause, in which Germany took full responsibility for the death, the destruction, the monetary cost of the war. And of course, they were forced to pay reparations to the tune of about 33. Let's make that a little bit bigger. There you go. $33 billion in reparations, which in today's dollars, again, would be probably pushing $1 trillion or more. So, in order to get the League of Nations put into the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson had to make concessions, and those concessions were Germany's to blame. They have to pay for it. So, because of the fact that Wilson did not bring along with him, did not consult key Senate Republicans. Keep in mind, Wilson is a Democrat. Because of that, the Senate rejected the treaty. Wilson had hoped that the League of Nations would prevent future wars. Well, maybe it would have. I have no idea. But his opponents, the Republicans in Congress, argued that the League of Nations, would drag the country into unnecessary military commitments. And we were still not really over the belief that neutrality, isolationism was the way to go. Many within America still wanted to remain neutral, remain isolated, and by joining the League of Nations, that would force us to join world affairs in a way that many in the Senate did not need or want to happen. Because of the fact that this is a treaty, and the Senate must ratify it, you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify the treaty, in this case, any treaty, in this case, the Treaty of Versailles. But Woodrow Wilson, rejected, clean that up so you can see the R there. There you go. He rejected any compromise with the Senate. Because he failed to compromise, the Treaty of Versailles was never ratified by us. Let's go on to our next slide and look at the leader, the individual who was pushing against the Treaty of Versailles. His name is Henry Cabot Lodge, and there is this information about when he was born and when he died. Had studied history and political science at Harvard University. An educated man from a well-to-do background. He came from money and privilege. He was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt and a strong supporter of imperialism. I think we talked about Henry Cabot Lodge earlier when we were discussing our chapter on imperialism. Lodge had been in charge of the Congressional Committee. Lodge was in charge of the Congressional Committee that had investigated the conduct of the U.S. Army in suppressing rebels in the Philippines. And so he has some background in this, in foreign affairs. He had some information, some knowledge on what it took to be an empire. Again, he was a strong supporter of imperialism. He wanted to see America grow. So he's not one of those stick your head in the sand kind of people who felt that we should remain neutral, we should remain isolationist. But he was a strong opponent of the League of Nations. Why? Well, he believed that if the United States were to join the League, the United States, I don't really need to do this, I just have fun doing this. Anyway, he believed that if we were to join the League of Nations, then the United States would lose, and this is the key word right there, lose much of its freedom of action. There's a lot of the same arguments being made today about the United Nations. As I think I mentioned to you earlier, there is a small gun ban in the United Nations today that's circulating. I know President Obama and many, if not all, the Democrats believe in this bill. And if it were to be signed by us, and if it were to be ratified, which, by the way, it's never going to be, but if it were to be ratified, then essentially we would lose our Second Amendment rights. And that's kind of what Henry Cabot Lodge and many of the Republicans in the Senate at the time felt would be a problem. We would lose our freedom of action. The Constitution would become secondary to the actions of the United Nations, or in this case, the League of Nations. Let's move on to the next one. We only have a few more to go. To overcome the Senate's objections, President Wilson decided to appeal directly to the American voters for support. Let me go back to my red color. clean up this mess. Sorry about that. So, Wilson went directly to the American public for support. He went on a national speaking tour. He had articles written and printed in local newspapers and magazines, all attempting to gain support for the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, which of course included the League of Nations. But he, Wilson, failed to gauge the feelings of most Americans. He just did not really understand that most Americans didn't want this. During his tour, unfortunately, Wilson suffered a stroke, which of course meant that his tour was slowed down, put to one side while he recovered. When the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, nothing could be done. Again, in this case, the Constitution is quite clear. When there is a treaty that is negotiated by the president or people working for the president, executive branch, for example, let's say the Secretary of State. When a treaty is negotiated between us and other nations, it must go to the Senate. It is the law, okay? The Senate must ratify it by a 2/3 vote. That is the law. Nothing can be done unless that treaty is ratified. So, despite Wilson's grand vision, and his grand vision would be his 14 points, and of course, most importantly, the League of Nations. Despite Wilson being the architect of the League, of the 14 points, being a key member in the writing of, the negotiating of the Treaty of Versailles, in spite of all the concessions he gave up to the English and the French, the harsher treatment toward the Germans, the war guilt clause, the reparations, in spite of all of that, the United States, and let me use a nice big bold color here, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. So, what do? We retreat back into isolation. Why? Well, because by 1919, the war is over. In November of 1919, most Americans were disillusioned with world affairs. We had heard, we had even seen, to some extent, keep in mind, the ability to capture images, motion picture, was available at this time, and there were quite a few that were taken. We've seen some of those already. We'll probably see a few more of those videos before we finish with this chapter. Anyway, we had seen, we had heard, we had read about some things that were happening around the world in regards to World War I, and we were becoming, again, quite disillusioned. We wanted to go back to the way things were. The small gains that seemed to have been made in World War I, and again, those small gains would be the end of the bad guys, the empires of Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Ottoman Empire. Those small gains seem to have come at quite a terrible cost. 20 million dead. Now, of course, our own numbers are far less than that. We've already discussed that. But that's a huge cost, not only in terms of loss of life, but the amount of money we spent on this war. The amount of sacrifice many Americans made. And I don't mean just the ones who died in conflict or who were wounded or their families, but the sacrifices many Americans made in order to win this war was just not worth it. So once again, what do? We go back to George Washington and his advice. We heed Washington's advice to avoid European entanglements. And so what do? We are going to avoid whatever Europe's up to, and we are going to turn our attention towards the material well-being here at home. So we here in the United States return to isolationism. We're going to avoid what the heck is happening in Europe, and we're going to turn our attention to what's going on at home, our own material well-being, jobs, money, improving our own standard of living. America returns to its more traditional policy of isolationism, separating ourselves from other countries' affairs. We turned our backs on Europe, by raising tariffs. And of course, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So we made imported goods more expensive, so we bought less of them. And of course, what does Europe do? They retaliate, but that's not really important. We were, at the end of the war, the most dominant military and economic power on the country because we had been relatively untouched. Yes, we did lose hundreds of thousands. We had hundreds of thousands of casualties, dead and wounded. True indeed. But that is a very small percentage when you look at, and we will look at the numbers for the other countries. You look at the millions who died or were wounded in European countries like France, Germany, Austria, and even Russia. Even though they ended their fighting the war early, they still suffered greatly. So what we're looking at, we, the United States, are the dominant power. And by raising these tariffs, we're basically telling the Europeans, we don't want anything to do with you. We also restrict European immigration. Partially that's due to not wanting to mingle with them, but it's also due to the Red Scare, which we'll take up in the next chapter. So, we reject the Treaty of Versailles. We refuse to join the League of Nations. We pass higher tariffs, and we have new immigration restrictions. These were all signs of America's decision to turn inward, to return once again to an isolationist mode. And that ends our section 4 of chapter 9, America at War.